Silver Society.
Welcome to the Silver Eye Society podcast, our special series, Libraries Circus, where we dig through the books that inform our views when we deconstruct the movies in our other episodes. And this episode is an extension of a past episode we've already done on the same book. We're going to be digging into some of the serious history behind communism, in particular, two figures. It's just Lenin, right? We're just doing Lenin this time. I know you're over there in the Lenin. Communist bloc. Just Lenin.
Yeah, it's just Lenin.
That's his album.
Right,
just
here's the
Lenin.
book.
Name it for the listeners.
Lenin.
Oh.
Name of the book is Lenin. Yeah, by Victor Sebastian.
Okay, excellent. So in this episode, we're going to talk primarily about the morality of the left, which I think is a really interesting topic of discussion because, as most everybody knows, if you really try to boil down all these arguments, all the debates, all the culture war stuff that goes on every day that sucks our attention into it, a lot of it comes down to morality. What's right, what's wrong, what needs to change, what is wrong in the past, things that we thought were fine, now casted in an evil light. What's up with all of that? What's up with morality? That's how I introduce all the topics of the podcast. What's up with that? Okay, so let's go into Lenin's profile a little bit in terms of him being a true believer in things. I think this is an interesting part of his personality. So explain to us.
I'd be happy to do that, but first we'll have the word of the podcast. The word of the podcast is a deep moral, ethical tradition, a tradition of this podcast, a tradition I hope that will be reoccurring throughout the millennia which this podcast is hosted by yours truly, Justin A.W. Blair, the Anselme Siboney.
Please don't.
We're going to go with the word tradition. It's a request from my co-host, and I honor it. A noun, late 14th century. I think we all know the late 14th century was apparently I like to call it the word factory century, the 14th century in terms of the English language. Would you agree?
A provisional agreement.
Very well. Statement, belief, or practice handed down from generation to generation, especially belief or practice based on Mosaic law. Didn't know that. From Old French, tradition, transmission, presentation, handing over. It goes into a lot of stuff. I'm not going to hit you with the Proto-Indo-European roots. All right? That's for Patreons only. You can sign up. You want the Proto-Indo, the pi roots. That's what the etymologists know them as.
Yeah.
Pi. It says pi roots.
That makes sense. They can't be
Proto-Indo-European.
doing that every time. It's exhausting.
So, we're going to talk about a time when traditions were upended. A time and a man, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin, who had a large part in destroying tradition.
Yeah, he wasn't into, okay, so this is kind of like always the leftist shtick, right? It's like everything old is bad. So you had that with Mao's Cultural Revolution. That was the first thing that, like, this episode, as we were planning for it, came to mind, was the Cultural Revolution started with a movement, essentially, that was entitled The Four Olds. So the aim was to destroy old things. So it was like, I don't remember what the four old things were, but like it was basically art, artifacts, whatever, music, just all of it. Like everything that was old, which is essentially traditional, was to be removed. And so people they lost, like family heirlooms, jewelry, whatever, things like that.
I've seen it in person.
Oh.
I saw in China a Taoist temple complex where I think the heads from some of the statues have been smashed off.
Oh.
So it's real to me. I've seen it.
That's so
interesting. I wasn't there. Not that old. I'm not one of the four olds. I wasn't there during the Cultural Revolution. But it is a real thing.
Yeah, there's something really like almost metaphorical about this idea of destroying the old, because there's something at the same time maybe attractive about this. And this comes into the fact that Lenin was a true believer. It's not that a lot of these figures started out with like, oh, we're going to destroy the tradition because that's how we'll deviously slip in our new traditions. A lot of these people that were carrying out these ideals believed that much of their ailments in the present came from the failures of the past. So,
And to some degree, they were correct.
yeah, exactly, because everything is imperfect, including the past and the peoples of the past. But there is something that seems to go amiss in thinking that the solution to that is to erase the past, rather than to actually try to humanize it and understand why it failed. Now, okay, so this is where we get into Lenin as a true believer. So why don't you give us a little bit of this kind of like, what is the profile of a true believer in destroying the traditions of the past? Because I want to get to something in this episode that I see lacking, and we've discussed as something that is absent from almost all these discussions about like leftist politics and what is going on and like all these radical changes, which is the people that are actually serious, the people that aren't on Twitter arguing about pronouns or trying to get Netflix shows canceled, like real political action, which I think Lenin is a great example of the difference of like armchair activists and truly committed political actors.
He's certainly committed. He still, and this is one of the problems that maybe we'll touch on towards the end of the episode, a lot of the actual violence was an abstraction for him. But as I've said in the first part of this is a subject that's so large we can't obviously cover all of it. We can't talk about the entirety of the Russian Revolution or even the entirety of Lenin. But briefly, he came from a kind of middle-class background. He was educated. He really was, for the most part, a writer, a polemicist, a editor. He was an exile. He was, in his own life, oftentimes very much it's complex because he lived in a frugal manner while he was in Western Europe, while he was essentially exiled.
Why was he exiled?
For political, he had been, so his brother had been hanged in a plot where his brother had tried to basically get explosives to assassinate the Tsar. His brother also was a very true believer. And this is why the subject is so big. If we're talking about Lenin, the person, obviously that's a big trauma. His brother, Lenin was always thought of as a rather cold person, but he wasn't inhuman whatsoever, and it was his family, and his brother was executed. So that plays a part in it. But beyond that, he also really believed in the tenets of Marxism. That he very much did. So he gets into trouble. Long story short, he gets into trouble where he's at universities, there's protests, there's this and that. And at the end of the day, he takes off to Western Europe, and he moves around Western Europe quite a bit. He's in various places. He's in Switzerland. He's in the UK. Obviously, he's in Finland sometimes. He's all over the place. He doesn't... What I want to get to, though, is that he truly believes these things, Marxism. He also isn't... He's not a person who takes the money that the organization gets and spends it on himself. He doesn't, funnel money. He doesn't live lavishly. This thing you see a lot of times associated with both the left and the right. People that are kind of, you see this on the right with generals, like generals of South American dictatorships or whatever, wherever you want to put the dictatorship, they make themselves very wealthy, in the process of their supposed belief in whatever tenets they hold. And this happens on the left and the right. Lenin did not do that. He did not do that. He lived in a very really Spartan style in a lot of ways. I mean, not entirely. He enjoyed walks in nature. He's relatively towards his family, observing fairly traditional morality, though there is something here where he does have an affair, but his wife knows it and to some degree condones it. And that's another subject we could talk about, because there is this, on the left at this time even, there is this sense of the traditional values of the family and sexuality even are something to not necessarily adhere to as well. But that's a whole nother trail we could go down to. My point is that Lenin believed in Marxism. He also saw the world, there's a quote in here, as a vile hell. He saw the world as it was in Russia and the Russian situation as a vile hell. And when you see that, if you're confronted with what you think is hell, and to some degree, Russia during World War I was hellish, then that opens up the ability to do anything morally. If you're fighting hell, you're fighting Satan, And so then the world of morality opens up, and what might seem traditionally moral is no longer so.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting point, that quote that he sees the world as a vile hell, because as soon as I saw that, I thought, well, yes, of course, everything is justified then. And that's why I'm really suspicious personally of people that have extremely cynical outlooks in a certain regard, the kind that doesn't allow them to recognize what does work and what is good and what is worth holding on to and protecting. Because if you see everything as degenerate and evil, then why would you salvage anything? Why would you be tempered in your approach to changing things? On the contrary, everything is on the table if you're in a certain kind of desperate situation. And the world being a vile hell sounds pretty desperate.
So quoting Lenin, London, May 1907, yes, we steal, but we steal what has already been stolen. So for him, theft isn't theft because the capitalist system is legalized theft. And so to steal isn't morally wrong. Also, this is an excerpt from a conversation in London, same time period. Lenin, in order to take power, every means must be used. And someone named Angelica Balbanova says, what, even dishonest ones? And he says, everything that is done in the interests of the proletarian cause is honest. Now, later, and again, I didn't want to portray him as particularly a soft, morally righteous person. He wasn't. But he wasn't also, what I was trying to get at is that he wasn't, like you see sometimes now, let's say certain organizations, leftist ones, who get a lot of donations and money, and they may spend that in
buy
ways
themselves mansions.
They may spend that on mansions or a lot of really nice real estate. That wasn't what Lenin was doing. Now, he did a lot of really terrible things later in the pursuit of power and the pursuit of Marxism, but
see, that's the difference. That's the difference, I think, right there. And who is more frightening to you? The person.
Lenin.
Exactly.
Greed is easy to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's it. Like the Black Lives Matter organization, after they bought themselves those mansions, that's it. They kind of actually discredited themselves, and I believe after that was associated with the riots and whatever, that lost a lot of popularity. But I believe now, I mean, that story comes out, how many people actually did donate, and that story came out, and it's like, this is kind of like there's a kind of that kind of greed, right? Doesn't have a long-term vision. And it's the political actor with the long-term vision that genuinely believes, like Lenin does, that's not actually interested really in just the riches, just the power that can come with it in terms of wealth, but truly wants to see the enacting of their ideology. That person goes the whole way. They don't stop once they get the mansions. They don't destroy their credibility and their momentum because they found a little bit of treasure already. they keep going. And that's the difference. I mean, not to say that this is not something to be concerned with, because amassing that kind of wealth is in and of itself power and is something to be concerned about when it's done through that kind of like deception and so easily done. Like everybody, how many people were scammed? A lot. So, but this is different though. That's my fear, and that's the fear that you talk about a lot too. It's like all this stuff is whatever. It's not great, but it's not the same caliber of threat until you get a figure that is truly dedicated to the end, like how Lenin is.
You need two things, at least. You need a figure who's a true believer, but you also need the social circumstances that are so terrible that it pushes mass society to go insane, and also to be willing to rob, steal, rape, kill, whatever it is that they want to do, and then justify it. So you have both those things in Russia at this time, because they're suffering through terrible, terrible things right before the First World War, and then, in the aftermath of it. So everything was there. And then you have someone like Lenin and a whole lot of other people who really did believe. And then later you get Stalin. But, it's funny because one of the problems that happens, and very early on, in Lenin himself noted this, it's so funny. I really recommend this book. It's easy to read. It's an important book to read to understand some things. Lenin started to see what would become called the nomenclatura, which is just bureaucratic communist officials who become party members simply to get a nicer apartment or to get tickets to eat from the nice, because that's what they did. They gave special privileges eventually to communist officials, party officials, all that. Not even to mention the problems with all of the, in the very beginning of the revolution and all these really several years afterwards, just straight up pillaging on the part of, and it's not just the communists. I mean, the whole country is in complete disarray. I mean, but they had to ban, like, the communists were like raiding the wine cellars, or wine cellars, not cellars, merchants, but I mean the basements where the wine was kept, of the rich people, and then distributing and getting drunk. I mean, the first moments of the actual revolution is really funny, because it's also terrifying, because that's maybe a little out of scope of this podcast actually, but it's like a couple hundred people sitting on folding chairs. I don't know if they're folding chairs, like just chairs in this kind of place where they just walked into and then proclaimed themselves the government.
It's insane.
And then you start to see and it's like they could have been wiped out. Mm-hmm. Even Lenin himself was like, they're going to they're going to hang us. They're going to, like, this is the perfect time. Why don't they do it? And then the Kerensky provisional government, whatever, it's a big thing. And but that's also scary, but a little off topic.
There's something really interesting about that, because there's like, that reminds me of something we've seen in a movie before, but I can't remember what it is. There's like that moment, that shift in power, and there's something really clunky about it for a second, because it's like there's something weird about realizing that the old guard, the old structures are nothing but like a display anymore, There's something very strange about that. Yeah, I that's kind of always the thing that I've thought is really weird and scary about revolution, and that people don't really realize, because I think it's very hard to understand what true lawlessness means until you feel that all of that has melted away. Then you feel suddenly so vulnerable, because all you would have is yourself. Like, there is no one you can turn to except, then you get, okay, I'm going to turn to protection from this group, or I'm going to ally myself with this gang or whatever. Like, that's what ends up happening. And it's a very, like, there's just kind of like that naked moment, right? Like, just like them sitting around. And there is something comical about it, but it is dark also. So, okay, you mentioned here, so Lenin would close the press. He would institute political terror, murder, create a secret police, stop the Soviet councils from having power, and then he justifies it all with kind of the rhetoric that you've said, which is like, well, when we steal, it's not stealing because we're stealing the things that were stolen from us. And that kind of twisty rhetoric is really, really something that we see a lot now. And I think it's the kind of intellectualizing of stuff. And I think, I don't know, partially I feel like that's where we are as a human, like as a species right now, is in knowing the difference, like the danger of over intellectualizing things. Like you can intellectualize anything. And so you'll find this, right? Like, so let's talk now about something that we see as a perfect example of this, which is the rehashing of all these values that are kind of sacred to the West and particularly the United States. So free speech. Free speech is maybe one of the founding values of this country. There's something, because you're right, you came from, the country was fleeing a persecution, religious. There was also kind of like the persecution with the printing presses. There was censorship there and all of that when that was first happening. And the United States has its issues with free speech and whatever. But it has always seemed to kind of, like, my understanding of the history is like, this is a very central value to the country. And it is one of what, if not the most, a country with the most free speech across the world. That's, at least at the level of industrialization and civilization that it is.
No, it's the number one. I would say that in terms of practically speaking, I don't know, but it is, we have more free speech than the UK by far.
For sure.
That's because it's within the written constitution. Now, I just finished a book about Thomas Jefferson. We'll deal with that in another podcast. But, the president right before him, Adams, had done something called the Alien Sedition Acts, which was very much not free speech. It was, and you see, it's not been a perfect run. No one's making a claim over here that it's been a perfect run in terms of free speech. But you get this thing from Lenin, and he says it very clearly, and this is the most telling, potentially parallel, that I think transcends left and right. It has more to do with just power. And but in this case, we're sticking with Lenin and the left. He says free speech is a bourgeois prejudice. And here's his reasoning briefly. It's that, of course, if you have a power structure, and this will sound very familiar to everyone, if you have a power structure in place, then free speech oftentimes just privileges the people that are already in power. And look, I mean, you understand that is what the radical left says when they close down speeches by people they don't like at campuses. This is straight out of that. Now, it's moved away from economics into other
culture,
weird identity politics
and,
stuff.
Yeah, identity
right,
politics, safety rhetoric, and stuff like that, which appeals, and race. And I think this is why maybe it's maybe somehow we're slightly off in being able to identify it, but it takes the identity of the time, which is something that our culture is more prone to deal with, which is like this reckoning from, the country's past crimes against, with racism and whatever, and sexism and all this. And it's so appropriate for this time, this rhetoric of safety. It's a foreign concept, that idea of safety. If you go just a few centuries back, that idea that safety would be, from words, from ideas, safety in your feelings, all of that is foreign, if not non-existent, within just a few centuries back. The way that it's talked about now.
If you think about the religious context with not allowing blasphemy, in a sense, you could say the religious rules against...
It wasn't individualized, though. It wasn't individualized in the sense that, like, these words are going to make a gay person kill themselves. That's the rhetoric of safety that I see now, which is kind of like, that's the Peterson characterization of the devouring mother. That's that kind of idea, that it's like this rabid desire for safety and protection of these vulnerable people, but to the extent that it neutralizes everything that could even potentially be a threat in attempting to protect, these faceless vulnerables or whatever, like these just anonymous people. Because it's very interesting. It'll be people that are like not the ones that they're saying are in danger, are the ones that are advocating. So it's like upper class white liberals on an Ivy League campus saying that, oh, there are, poor brown immigrants that are going to kill themselves because Ben Shapiro is giving a speech. It's like, no, where are they? Like, what? Why? Let them say it. So,
well, and that's so I agree with that. And that's something you see a lot.
So
what you also see, bring it back here, is that it didn't take very long at all, once Lenin gained power, to shut down the free press. It took him a while because he wasn't in complete... It took... Again, this is a little bit outside the scope of the podcast, but it takes a while for them to consolidate power. But slowly it does happen. And it's a great story because... there's a newspaper in Russia at the time called like Daylight or Day or something. I don't remember. Den maybe is a Dobry Den. Yeah, it should be Den. It's like, and then Lenin is like shuts them down, and then they just rename their newspaper the next day, Noon, and then he shuts them down, and then they rename the newspaper Evening the next day, and then he shuts them down, and their last paper was called Midnight. The name of the paper was called Midnight because it was the end. They knew it was the end. Like, you see, they moved from all the way through there. And it's a sad story.
Scary.
It is scary. But, so.
Okay, so wait, really quick. Free speech is a bourgeois prejudice. I want to make a brief note because I actually read this quote pretty close to seeing some SNL skit mocking Elon Musk wanting to work with Twitter to encourage, a more free speech friendly environment on the application. And SNL, I believe the thing that I saw from them, this, like, obviously I didn't watch the whole thing, but it was like, this is, whether it was this or something else related to it, it's the same kind of trope, which is you just want free speech to say slurs. That was the thing. It was like, wow, Elon Musk wants to say the N-word so badly that he'll buy Twitter to do it. And it's just like, then I saw this quote, free speech is a bourgeois prejudice. Those are the same to me because it's the idea that you only want free speech to oppress people. You only want free speech to do malicious things. Why would you need it otherwise? Just say the right things. And so this ethos that the desire for free speech is suspect is so entwined with the current leftist viewpoint. They are synonymous. And
oh, yeah, it is.
That to me, there is no salvaging that. Like, there is no compromise there.
No, I'm not compromising. There's no fucking compromise over here. And who gives a fuck what SNL says? No one watches that. You probably saw like a clip of it because that's the only thing anyone watches.
Of course, yeah.
But no compromise. So Obama came out with a speech, which he probably got paid a bunch of money for somewhere, that I also did not listen to, but someone sent me this weird... I'm not going to go into that. It was just like some guy reporting on his speech, and it sounded like such a fucking sycophant. It was like President Obama. It was like this breathless, like, oh, look at how great of a leader Obama is. He just said this, and it's making me think so hard. And it just sounded like this generic kind of look, it was, he speaks better than Trump and a lot of other people, sure, but
it's a politician.
It's a politician. I'll cut it to the chase, though. He said something like, I actually am close to a free speech absolutist. He says this in his speech. But then, of course, there's a caveat, as there always is. And he says, but if it's something against the dignity of people, then I'm against it. The dignity of people. And it's like, well, okay. I mean, it's one of those phrases that sounds nice. And it's like, and everyone... Because, see, it frames it a certain way. So now if I argue against that, I have to say, I'm against the dignity of people, but who fall? Only morons fall for these tricks anymore. I think that's a thing.
People
We're
that want to fall
out.
for them.
That language is worn down so far that the only people that pay attention to that are brain dead people that watch SNL. So fuck that. But anyway, what? It's bad. It's just bad. It's
all
bad
bad.
garbage.
It's all bad. Every sentence here is worthy of intense discussion, because there's the sycophant thing, right? Which is like, we've turned all our politicians into deities, into saints. So that's where you get that kind of like, he's glowing. Everything he does is right and righteous. He is here. He has risen. Obama will save us. It's
but
like,
it was also probably some 50-year-old white guy who probably worked for Goldman Sachs and had paid like $20,000 to be in the audience. So I mean, it's just this is
release me.
This is where
Circus.
Lenin has some points. Yeah.
Can't say he doesn't have some points. That's true. Okay.
Anyway,
let us resume. All right. So free speech is a bourgeois prejudice. This is a communist bedrock of the ideology. Like this is the last frontier in some regard, because it's like, okay, the thing is that everything else falls from that. It seems that everything else falls from that. Once you lose the ability to actually push back through debate, the value of even, that process of debate, there's no debate, which means there's no back and forth, there's no pushback. So I mean, this is to me like the thing I will actually, like the hill I will die on. So okay, let's return a little bit to denigration of traditions and all of that. We're gonna tie up here, and then we'll end it somehow. Okay, so look, I have a question here.
all right.
So we spoke about how Mao did the same thing, Lenin did the same thing. You want to go ahead?
Yeah. Sorry, I know that my notes are dense, and I appreciate the fact that you go through them and make it better. But I wanted to say something about this moment with Lenin, and to try to maybe draw a parallel with some of because look, I don't think that a lot of people on the left right now are power mad liars. I think that they believe some of the things that are being said, and that some of them are dealing with problems, and they're dealing with it in their framework that they can and all that. I believe that. Now, I don't believe that people sitting on the board of Twitter care about, whatever, an Eskimo or something, a trans Eskimo that is like, maybe their feelings are hurt on Twitter. I just don't believe. Some of them maybe. Some of them do maybe. I'm not going to, maybe. I think that the true powerful people are they just want censorship because they need to control a narrative, because there's so much corruption in the system right now that they have to. But
they make money. I don't know what the fucking problem is here. Like, what happened? There was once a left that was suspicious of big business corporations, suspicious of power, but they got eaten up by the institution. They got co-opted by the institution, and there seems to be no better way than to destroy a movement than to actually co-opt it into the institution, because then it just becomes the monster that it thought it was fighting. So, I mean, once upon a time, the left would have been suspicious of Twitter's, posing as some kind of benevolent arbiter of morality or whatever. They would have seen through that. But to be fair,
there still are voices on the left. One of the Jimmy Dore is a comedian who's leftist, who's very much like a free speech proponent.
They need a new word. It's not a liberal.
I know. But that's why I tried to say in the notes is that this isn't currently, we're seeing it on the left, I think. Now, some people would argue there's a right-wing faction in the country who also is, once empowered, might stop free speech also. Certainly the right has done that in the past in many other countries. I'm not trying to suggest that somehow this is only a leftist thing, though there's a particular line of thinking and way that it happens on the left. And I think if we were to generalize it, it would be that it is oftentimes about we're going to impose totalitarian controls in order to help the oppressed. Mm-hmm. I think the right tends to censor and come down hard on free speech and values, which I think are traditional and important to America for different reasons. I don't think that a lot of like generalissimos generally imprison their political opponents based on that speech is hurting the oppressed. So all I'm trying to say is that this is a specific left-wing thing, and that I'm trying to look at the anatomy of that to a degree.
Yeah.
There was a broader point I was trying to get to, and I haven't had enough coffee, and I forgot what it was.
Oh, I know.
You were leading me into the optimism.
Okay. Oh.
They call me Mr. Optimism sometimes.
Yeah, okay.
So it's 1917. What I'm trying to say is that Lenin hadn't yet seen the mass killing of Stalin. He hadn't yet seen the mass killing of Chairman Mao. He hadn't seen the mass killing in Cambodia and several other communist regimes yet. This is new. This is now, again, he very quickly starts to order, though not on anywhere the level of Stalin, but he executes his political opponents. Oftentimes in a very abstract way. He's not the same as Stalin and a lot of these other people. It's this intellect, and this is the danger actually though, and the danger that maybe is a little bit important to us, is that Lenin's an intellectual. He's a chess player. He's a reader, a writer, all that kind of stuff. And yes, he knows what's going on. And yes, he straight up orders it sometimes. And he applauds those that murder sometimes. But he doesn't. He's a lot of times where he also very much is standoffish about it. Like he knows it's going to happen. He lets his underlings essentially do it. But beyond that, even there's still there was an optimism, and it has to be addressed. There was an optimism in the moment, in the early Russian Revolution, on the part of these far leftist Bolsheviks, communists, all this. They thought they were going to make a better world. And the world was a vile hell in a lot of ways in Russia at that time. So I get it. That optimism dies very quickly, though. And I think that that's a danger you see a lot, and you see it today, is that this idea of let's remake the world to be better, and there's no thought of the consequences. And not only that, there's no thought about the people who may seize power in the name of that and commit atrocities.
Yeah.
I don't think we're there. I don't think that, the board of Twitter is going to commit war crimes or anything, but I'm just saying that here are some of the dangers that are there.
Yeah,
potential.
That idealism. Here's the thing that's so odd, though. It's like now we have all that history. Now you have all those examples of how that played out, and yet you still have a real resurgence of this interest in those ideologies. I think a lot of people don't know, though. I think the one thing here is that a lot of people don't know that the ideas they're promoting, the rhetoric they're using, this kind of thing like, oh, free speech is actually dangerous, or free speech is just something that you want so you can be a white nationalist or whatever. And these things of like, oh, we need to protect people from words, and we need to protect people from misinformation. So we need to control things more and have a centralized system of control just so that we can protect people. I think all of this rhetoric is in some way detached from its birthplace, from this kind of like leftist authoritarianism. And because of that, people don't feel like they don't even think it, but they don't have to do that work of, explaining away, well, how is it that I explain all these failed attempts, all these hundreds of millions of people that have died through this same rhetoric, through these same ideologies? how is it going to be different this time? I don't think they feel responsible for explaining that past away. You know, it's like they don't see that it's attached to that, so they don't feel the need to. There's no cognitive dissonance about it. Like, it's just they're removed, but they're not. That's maybe possibly the scariest thing for me, and I've actually started to notice this thing in people's writing. A lot of the leftist type of writing, and I mean like armchair leftists, like people on Twitter, people making memes and shit, people writing little Instagram captions that are, you know, paragraphs long about, oh, why we need, you know, equity in video games characters or whatever. And it's like, all of it sounds like an MFA student essay. All of it sounds like the shit that I had to write in academic writing. Like, it doesn't, but it's out of the lab, you know, it's escaped from the zoo essentially. And so it's like these things seem to have escaped academia and become part of like kind of just general culture. But I also thought about this yesterday. I realized we've been pushing academia as the only answer to upwards mobility for what, how many decades? Like several decades at least. You know, and for several generations, I think, at least. Like, what, my generation that's there now maybe is starting to get out of that. I don't know what generations come before me. Whatever, for several decades, we can say, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. So, you have a population
because we deindustrialized, but I mean, that's a larger question.
Okay, no.
I don't want to interrupt you too much.
Don't. But yeah, this is what I'm saying. It's like, everybody's funneled into academia. Like, there's not even, like, so it's like you just have these ideas that are just becoming part of culture. This language that becomes part of culture. It's a very strange thing to see people talk like they're writing an essay on Twitter.
Right. Well, so, and there is maybe a potential danger here, though probably not. But so what it is a bunch of people who paid $50,000 in student loans or whatever to get an English degree, and they don't have a job. So, of course, they're writing the same terrible prose on Twitter. They're bad writers, which is one of the reasons I don't fear them, because they're so fucking boring that they put themselves to sleep. Lenin was a great writer. That is something about, well, I won't say he was a great writer. Lenin was fiery. And used, and there's a whole other thing which we didn't actually touch on, which is that a lot of an area where he was a very vicious person was in attacking people personally. So a lot of times he would avoid arguments on the merits and he would just attack the human, which is something we do see sometimes.
Yeah.
And to be fair, that's not even a left or right thing, though. I think that this author at least says that set the precedent within the communist world of how you dealt with people who went outside of the framework of the rules. So it was denouncement. You know, it wasn't just, hey, you made a mistake in Marxism, Leninism. It's, you know, heaping insults upon them. And then obviously in China, we get a whole nother thing with the Cultural Revolution, other times. And struggle sessions and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, again, I mean, there's so many topics we could talk about and try to bring parallels together. But what I wanted to say is that, of course, these Twitter people who are writing this terrible, boring stuff, they're middling people. They're kind of middling intelligences, you know, who went and paid too much for a degree, which is frankly useless because the market is glutted with you know, gender studies graduates and English literature graduates. So what are they going to do? That's where there's a bit of a problem, because you have this whole class of people who've been fucked in a way. They probably kind of know they've been fucked. You know, they have useless degrees. The reason you don't hear this from plumbers is because they're out plumbing. You don't hear it from electricians is because they're out doing electrical stuff. They're not on Twitter writing these dense paragraphs with jargon, which no one wants to hear besides the other people that paid $50,000 for a degree that's useless. I feel sorry for them to a degree. And they're so well, you know what? I won't attack the person.
There is something very weird, though, about it, because it's like there is something like maybe get a job, get a real job or something instead of like writing dissertations on, reality TV and then writing a response dissertation on why that reality TV take is racist or whatever. Like there is this sense of these people that are like driving themselves insane with a lack of true purpose and true work. And so they're inventing work for themselves, right? And that's kind of like this, it takes that political format, which ties in with the first part of the episode or the first part of this series on this book that we did, where you spoke about that one political actor, the woman that came from wealth, who had, a vacation home, whatever. Her parents allowed her like, oh, go do your political organizing at our vacation home. And it became like this kind of almost religious like compulsion to, this is my life, this is my work. And it's like, well, we see the kind of that same fervor taking a political form now.
My mind's going in a lot of different directions because this is a subject which I actually enjoy a great deal. This time in history, all of this I think very interesting. But so I'm going to speculate. I like to speculate. So this class of people, which we'll say are, and we're generalizing, but are people that they've gotten a degree in the liberal arts. And, look, it truly is a bit of a scam in the sense that, you can become an adjunct professor maybe and get paid like $15 an hour and have no benefits and they make you work a lot. Like it's a bad deal in a lot of ways. It's a bad deal. But when I start to think about this, so you have in this situation over here, you have the workers. Now, granted, Russia wasn't actually very industrialized, but the revolution took place in St. Petersburg. And so all this is about the proletariat and the workers, right? And so they go to factories and they rile people up. And that's where they get a lot of the bodies that they can use to put on the streets and to give them guns to do the revolution, right? Now, again, I'm not trying to draw too close parallels, but they were a disgruntled class of people. And to be fair, rightfully so, the workers in Russia, everybody had a shit deal to a large degree in Russia, besides basically the aristocracy and a very small amount of wealthy people. Fair enough. Here we have in our own time a disgruntled class of people that are in student debt, that maybe work at Starbucks. I know, again, these are it's not everybody, but it's a lot of people. And they're on Twitter, and all they have really is what they've been taught in this university environment. And then that didn't even serve them well. But there's a difference. If I'm a communist organizer in 1917, I know where the factory is located. I go to the factory and then I commit communist, I make speeches. I hand out pamphlets. I do this or that or whatever. I organize. You can't organize these people really because they don't go out of their house. They hang out and like do things on Twitter. So it's interesting to me to think about that like the only platform for this discontent is in cyberspace right now or whatever.
We hope.
Where you go, that's where I don't see a lot of danger necessarily, given the circumstances today, which is still relatively stable, even though it doesn't seem like it.
Well,
like where where you go to the campuses itself, which is where a lot of this does actually end up getting organized and like embodied in physical reality with protests and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But you don't have these types of people aren't working in factories. You know what I'm saying?
But they also can't speak to the working class for the most part, because they actually genuinely disdain the working class. Like, I don't think these people could go into like this kind of like people that are writing dissertations about why free speech is actually white supremacy and why eating meat is actually racist or whatever. Like this kind of like MFA level intellectualizing of cultural minutia. Those kinds of people can't speak to normal people, because they've lost the ability to speak clearly, even, to other people in their own lives at that point, when you're starting to speak in this, very strictly academic, narrow worldview language. I couldn't see them going to the factories and making this speeches. They've been in a way crippled by these ideologies because they can't speak to anyone except their own people, and so that's what they do. Like, they just spend all their time, trading spears with each other, and then every now and then trying to heap that onto the next closest target, which is like an actual liberal, like an actual, like a person that once was considered themselves the left and is now like, against the more authoritarian versions of it now. I think that there's like, now, of course, there is still the organizing. You still see, you have, people trying to, let's teach this stuff in schools, or let's do protests across the country or whatever. So it's like, how much can we say that, it's not really taking form on the streets and it's just online? I don't know, because maybe we just don't see it yet. But I don't know. That's my one hope, is that actually like regular people, like normal people that have life experience and didn't go like from the cradle to academia and then just get like force fed a bunch of truly like, academic mumbo jumbo. Those people that are not that still have like a kind of connection to the real world. And, like my family, whatever, like regular people that are not like hyper terminally online, they can pretty quickly see, like, what are you talking about? Like, free speech is racist. Like those ideas, they still jar with, the more normal type of people that don't live online and didn't like go into massive debt to learn, how to read racism into every piece of literature. So there's hope in the normal people.
They're largely ineffectual. What they are, though, is a space for people that are actually in power. They can use those ideas to their own ends.
Yes.
And then not only that, to some degree, people that are in power are and this is a problem with Twitter and that kind of thing, is that some people say that leads the discussion to such a degree that politicians, especially since most of our politicians are like 75 years old and don't even know what Twitter is, they think that's what they think that's what a majority of people think, because some intern tells them, hey, this is what Twitter's saying. Have you heard of Twitter? It's the thing called the internet. And they're like, is this a series of tubes? And they're like, yes, it's a series of tubes. It moves information back and forth. This is very important. And so then Twitter leads the discussion to some degree. Again, well outside the scope of a biography on Lenin. So much to say. However, perhaps viewers, listeners alike will need to... should I do the outro? Because I know that, I always put that burden on you.
Well, yes, you can do the outro, I guess. I just want to say that we'll sum up with one point here. Like, if there's nothing else that you get from this episode, I think the most important thing, like, truly, is to really use free speech, like genuinely use it, and not be cowed by these attempts to guilt people and to shame people and to trick people into thinking that there's something noble in letting your speech be taken from you. There's something, suspicious about wanting free speech. That is a scam of the highest order. So that's the moral of this episode. Speak. And I'm not telling anybody what to say. That's the thing. It's like, when you really believe in a thing, you don't have to tell people exactly what to believe or what to speak. You can trust that is, in and of itself, a good value, is for them to decide that. So that's my moral.
Well, I am telling people what to say, and what I'm telling them to say, to rehearse, to go to the factory floor, to scream to the workers, to the proletariat, to liberate them all, is... You can join the Silver Eye Society on Patreon. You can go to our website. We don't have a website, actually. I'm terrible at doing the outro.
They can go to my website. My website has the Silver Eye Society.
Oh, what's that?
Details, salomesibone.com. You can go there, and there is a page with podcast episodes. But you can also go to the Patreon, where you can become a patron. $2. Is that so much to fight the communists? I don't think so. So join us and let us know what you think, what you want to know more of, what you are interested in, and what we can help you with. we're trying to do the good work here. We're trying to fight the good fight, free speech, all of that. Join us at the Civil Rights Society, where speech remains free.
Goodbye.